Our third finalist is Joel Landis, working with Dr. Van Voorhis on a project entitled, Is China a Revisionist State? Examining China's military rise through power transition theory. Joel.
We're confronted with one of the most important questions in foreign policy today. Will there be a war with China? The picture being painted in the American mind seems to be conclusive that China is rising, but it is belligerent, it's militant, and it's expansionist. My research seeks to re-examine that question. I do this through power transition theory, and I examine China's military rise, and I posit that looking at their military rise, we can determine how they view the international order. In the coming years, when they continue to rise in power, are they going to try to change this order, or are they okay with it? Are they content with this order? So my argument relies upon power transition theory. This was a theory that was first posited in the late 50s and slowly was researched and refined, and now it is widely regarded as one of the best ways to understand conflict, trying to answer the perennial question, why do wars start? It challenges the conceptual basis for the balance of power model, in that it says peace is not maintained when there's a balance of power. Peace is maintained when there's one dominant state and then a hierarchy of subordinate states. And conflict is initiated when two factors are present in the international order. First, one of those subordinate states rises in power, and it rises in power to such a degree that a power transition is expected. So that rising power, in our case China, is expected to supplant that dominant power. Second, if that rising power evaluates the status quo, the international order, and determines that that status quo is prohibitive to its future success, it'll initiate a war in order to change that status quo. It's this second factor that my research looks at. Is China a revisionist state? Meaning, does China seek to revise the American hegemony, the world order of today? And if it does seek to revise that, that will mean war. I do this through looking at military expenditures. Why do we look at military expenditures? Why do they reveal so much about the Sino-American relationship? First, most of the research in power transition theory focuses upon the system. When will there be a power transition? Will there be a power transition? And this is the same in Sino-American relations. When will China rise? How will China rise? I argue we need to look at actors, the states themselves. War doesn't start just because of a system, because of a systemic change. War starts because of decision making. It is the states themselves that decide whether or not a war will happen or whether it will be prevented. And so we need to look at the states' decisions. And we need to look at the states' perceptions. Military expenditures reveal to us what a state's perceptions are of that world order. Because military expenditures are exclusively the result of a state's decisions, they're not affected by the system. They may inform the decision, but they're not affected by it. We can say that military expenditures do not necessarily have to correspond with reality, but they always correspond with the state's perceptions of reality. And so we can say that by analyzing military expenditures, we can look at how a state reacts to the world order. So we can say, let's look at Chinese military expenditures. By using those numbers, we can see how they evaluate the status quo, what their level of satisfaction is with the status quo, and whether or not they will seek to revise that status quo in the coming years. This is the model I use to analyze military expenditures. I derived it from a study of Douglas Lemke and Suzanne Werner. They were looking at the fact of, does military expenditures tell us anything about power transition? And they concluded that yes, it does, but they just did this widely, and I applied it to the Sino-American relationship. I had to modify it. I wasn't able to look at huge amounts of years because China really has only been rising since '78. And secondly, because there isn't present power parity, there isn't an equality of resources between China and the United States at the moment, you have to look at a military expenditure each year as a percentage of the GDP. We can talk about this in the questions if I need to discuss it further. But the question that this model answers is China allocating more resources to its military than the United States is? If China today is only spending 2% of its GDP on its military arm, and the United States is spending 5% of its GDP on its military arm, then the change in that percent on an annual to annual basis for China has to be higher than the United States change, so that in 20, 30 years, when a power transition does occur, it is able and willing to overtake the United States in a military conflict. If it remains at that 2% GDP level, its military will not be large enough to win a large-scale war, and its leaders, acting rationally, will not initiate a war. So that's the question this model is answering. And the results I found was that China is not allocating enough resources to initiate a war. In the past decade, it appears that they were completely satisfied with American hegemony. They were unwilling to allocate enough of their resources in order to prepare themselves, in order to mobilize their military so that they could initiate a war. And that they see American hegemony as the best world order for them to continue their rise. A question also has to be asked, well, just because China's not spending as much on its military out of its own resource pool as the United States is, what are they investing in? Couldn't they invest in these globalized militaries that, while small now, could be larger later? And the answer is no, they're still defensive in nature. I see two primary military goals that China is investing in. First is preventing American involvement in Taiwan. And this is nothing new. This has been the core of Chinese foreign policy since 1949. American policy experts are not surprised by this in any way. They are strengthening their measures. They're investing in short-range and medium-range ballistic missiles, anti-ship cruise missiles, and anti-ship ballistic missiles. Their foreign policy here is revolved around, if a Taiwanese independence scenario actually happened, let's deny American involvement. Let's deny the Pacific Fleet as long as we can in order that we can hold Taiwan. They're not trying to globalize their military or challenge the Pacific Fleet head-on in the middle of the Pacific. They're merely trying to deny American forces for a short amount of time. Secondly, they're intending to protect their economic trade routes. Something like 80% of their energy acquisition passes through the Strait of Malacca every day, south of Thailand. 20% of Chinese merchant vessels are being attacked by pirates off of Somalia. It's in the Chinese best interest to organize a navy that can protect these economic trade routes. For the Communist Party of China to maintain its legitimacy, it must maintain its economic rise, and to do that, it must maintain these economic routes. And so we see China making a green water navy. That is, not a navy intended for global operations, but only a navy intended for regional, short-term mobilization. This in no way challenges the United States. And they in no way intend to challenge the United States Pacific Fleet. They are perfectly willing to ride the coattails of American safety, but when they see trade routes that aren't being protected, they will mobilize their green water navy to protect those trade routes. So we can see that China is satisfied with American hegemony. They do not seek to revise any status quo to further their upward rise. They see that the American world order is in their best interest. Based upon this evidence, we just don't see China seeking war with the United States. And you see the American conception, the picture being painted in the American mind of a China that is rising and that there will be war. And it just doesn't appear to coincide with the evidence that I saw in my research. Thank you.
Questions for Joel?
Yes.
Do you think China is satisfied because they're simply buying up America and going to war?
The debt question is an important question. It's something that wasn't necessarily in the scope of my research, but I can talk a little bit about it. The reality is that we talk about there's a debt. They own a significant amount of our financial securities. They own a significant amount of our debt at large. There's a trade deficit in which they're gaining more from the relationship than we are. They're devaluating their renminbi, their currency, the yuan. That fear that is really perpetuated, I would say, by congressional leaders is very exaggerated. Our debt crisis in America isn't because of China. I would say that's a non-solution solution of people saying it's not our fault, it's China's fault. Our debt woes are really because of our spending habits, and China's investing in the dollar should be seen as a positive thing of China investing in interdependence of our economy, and that their investment in our dollar raises all ships. The only reason that they would see as dumping our securities to hurt our economy is if we enacted some grossly myopic protectionist measures, and then they would dump our securities. The present relationship is helpful for both countries. They have no desire to hurt us.
Additional questions for Joel?
Yes?
Would you say that some sort of conflict, such as a war, is specifically necessary for a power transition to take place?
No, in no way. And that's what this model posits, is that a power transition, in my research, I just assumed a power transition would take place, just to isolate that factor. If a power transition did take place and there wasn't war, it would mean that China sees that this American unilateralism, this way of running the world in which we kind of somewhat ignore the UN, but we work with each other economically, that would work best for China. So there's not necessarily a war that needs to take place for a power transition. They can beat us out in GDP and there not be a war. Yes?
Given that, you said that, like someone said, there already has been a power transition. And, I mean, that is such a strong interest in America and, I guess, control in a way that there could have already been some sort of shift in power. I mean, I know these folks are from a military point of view, but from an economic point of view, they probably already has been quite high. I think there has been.
No, I would agree that the power has somewhat shifted to China. But if we're discussing a power transition, it depends on what you're quantifying as dominant power. And in this, I quantified as GDP. You could use some other measures, but it's kind of a dichotomous measure. Either you're dominant power or not. It's not a slow shift of power. But I agree with you that China has slowly gained power. It's a question of, can they become an inventor nation and surpass us economically? Yeah.
So if China is already, just to say for example, if they are more powerful via economic reasons, can the United States regain that power through military forces?
Yes, I imply this in the paper, that if there would be conflict, it most likely would be top-down conflict from the United States end, not from the Chinese end. And this is how some explain World War I, that Britain saw Germany rising, and so there was a war because Britain wanted to prevent Germany from rising. That's one explanation. That wasn't something I looked into.
Let's thank our finalists.